Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me, whether you are watching live or you are watching the recording. I appreciate you watching. Today we're discussing PHP. And in discussing PHP, the plan for today is going to be to talk about PHP for a bit, show you a few things, demonstrate a few things. But ultimately, I would like to cap off the day walking through the lab with all of you, because I walked through the lab with the seated class this time. So I'd like to walk through the lab with all of you as well. So there is that. That's what we'll be doing today. So we're just going to talk about PHP for a while. We'll do a couple little demonstrations here as we are discussing PHP. And we'll close out today's live just by walking through the lab together. Because if I did it for the seated class, I should do it for you all as well. So let us talk about PHP. What exactly is PHP? PHP is an open source server-side scripting language. So far everything we've been doing is has been front end. HTML, CSS, JavaScript, in terms of our web development that we've been practicing, has been front end. But now we're going to be dealing with PHP, and PHP is back end. PHP is server side. That means it needs to be interpreted or compiled by the server before it's sent out to the browser to be rendered to the end user. It is a general purpose language, which means we can do a whole lot of different stuff with it. In general, it's not one of my favorites, right? There are a lot of other options in terms of stacks, right? If we remember back to when we were talking about back-end languages and front-end languages earlier in the year, we talked about several different types of front-end and back-end languages. And there are a lot of different front-end languages and back-end languages that are not PHP that, to me, I like a little bit better, right? Like you can use Python as a back-end language now that, it's a little bit friendlier, a little bit easier. In certain web stacks, you can use Java through Kotlin. You can use even JavaScript now through something like Node.js. Ruby on Rails, various other things, right? PHP is a little finicky. You have to be really specific and pay really close attention to detail as you are working with it. There are certain things that, we can get away with in other languages that we can't really get away with in PHP. PHP doesn't let us get away with it. So especially while we're learning, it can be a little bit tougher. But it is still widely used, right? Like the majority of sites in existence, for example, utilize WordPress as what we call a content management system, or CMS. For those of you who are in the programming and web development program, at some point in your educational career, you will take the content management systems class. And that class focuses on WordPress primarily because it is still the most widely used content management system in the world. Right? A wide majority of sites utilize WordPress as its content management system. Cleveland Community College's website utilizes WordPress. A bunch of websites utilize WordPress. Some that you might not even think about. And so as such, since PHP builds the backbone of WordPress, a lot of websites utilize PHP. And so I'd like to just introduce you all to the idea of PHP in this module. One, so you can see an example of a back-end language and you can see it in use. Two, so you can see another programming language and you can see code written from another programming language. And just get other practice in other languages. Because really, the further along we go, one of the biggest things that we can kind of get out of programming is the ability for adaptability, right? I can basically look at a singular programming language, see that it works or see how it works, learn from that programming language, and then apply things that I learn in that programming language to other programming languages as I learn them, right? Because the same basic logic and things of that nature are essentially used in all programming languages, right? One of the things that we've said as we've kind of gone through is we've seen examples in Python. We've seen examples of input, output, math, and repetition, logic, conditionals. We've seen examples of those same things in JavaScript, and we're going to see examples of those same things here in PHP as we're kind of going forward, right? So every single programming language has those same basic things in them. And so once we kind of get the understanding that, this is kind of how programming works, we start to operate under the we still have to operate with the knowledge, I guess I should say, that, programming languages in general are very, very similar, So we know that if we can do one thing in one programming language, there is a high degree of likelihood that we can do something similar in another. Right, so PHP is an acronym, and that acronym used to stand for Personal Homepage. It doesn't really stand for that anymore. Personal Homepage is kind of antiquated. And it wasn't really descriptive of what PHP did. But it wasn't really, we couldn't really shoehorn in a good meaning for the acronym after the acronym was already developed, right? So while PHP once stood for Personal Homepage, it doesn't mean that anymore. Now it's actually a recursive acronym that talks about what it does, which is a hypertext preprocessor, right? So since PHP is a server-side scripting language, that means that it is compiled on the server, and what is compiled on the server is changed into HTML and sent through HTTP to the browser to the end user. So it is pre-processing hypertext markup language, or HTML. So PHP being a hypertext preprocessor makes a lot of sense. So the P in PHP, the first P that is, stands for PHP. The H in PHP stands for hypertext, and the second P stands for preprocessor. So if we look at the entire acronym of PHP, the entire acronym of PHP stands for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor, which is kind of strange, but that's the way language evolves, I guess. It is a little bit on the weird side. But PHP was developed in 1994 by Rasmus Lerdorf. And it is currently on version 8, which was released in November of 2020. And, that should kind of tell you, that should kind of allow you to put some things in perspective about, versioning and how things work in that sort of way, right? Like, we saw Python come out around a similar time. Right, Python was also released in the early 90s, but now it's in, Python 3 is the version that we're using. Whereas PHP is on version 8 on a lot of servers out there. However, you'll still see version 7 in use a lot. It is still one of the most widely utilized server-side scripting languages on the web, and one of the reasons because of that is because the backbone of WordPress is built in PHP. Also, it's because one of the most widely used web stacks is still the LAMP stack, the Linux Apache PHP, or the Linux Apache MySQL PHP software stack that we were talking about earlier on in the semester. Right, so PHP came out as, kind of really, one of the first server-side scripting languages, and it had, it gained a lot of traction early on. Relatively easy to learn. Open source, platform independent, which we'll see in just a moment, right? In fact, I'll just go ahead and switch the slide here so we can see that the advantages of PHP. Right, that it is platform independent, so I can have it on a Linux server, I can have it on a Windows server, I can have it on a Mac server, I can have it on any type of server like that. It's going to be just fine. It's going to work without question. It is open source. Open source also typically means free, right? Which free is also very nice. So if I'm building out a tech stack that I want to use on my servers, and I need a server-side scripting language or a server-side programming language to, write some code with, a free one is going to be preferable to one that I have to pay for. It's going to be relatively easy to learn. Right? It is a little bit finicky in terms of, making sure that everything is just so. Right? But, we'll get there. One of the things that I like to say, just kind of as a joke is that, if you remember back to when we talked about JavaScript, I said that, JavaScript is kind of a one-sided relationship. I really like JavaScript. JavaScript doesn't always like me. Whereas PHP, I think, actively hates us. Just because, whenever we are writing PHP, if we forget a little something, if we put a little something out of place, it's going to error out and it's going to cause us a whole bunch of problems. And, unlike JavaScript or HTML or CSS, to where if we had a small error and things might still at least work a little bit, if we have a small error in PHP, nothing works. Big time errors. But we'll see some examples of that as we kind of progress. And it syncs with all databases. Primarily, we see it used with SQL, but it can be used with other types of databases easily enough. So before we get started writing some code, it is important to remember that PHP is a server-side scripting language, which means that we need a server, right? Because we need that server to be able to actually compile the code that we write. Now, we'll still be using Replit. The type of Replit that we'll be using is going to change a lot because we'll be needing a Replit that will create a virtual server for us so that we can actually write our PHP and have it interpreted. But there are also, if you want to practice on your own without Replit, there are some other types of software that you would need. You'd want to be able to create a virtual machine. If you have some practice creating virtual machines with, say, VirtualBox, that would be an option. Another option would be to use a piece of software called XAMPP, which, let me see if I can get that pulled up for you here. A piece of software called XAMPP that would create a local server for you that you could actually write PHP with. You can't just write a PHP file and expect it to work unless you have a PHP interpreter. So that is important to remember as we are getting to work here. And so as we're looking here, when it comes to working with PHP, our file structure is going to look very similar. We can still have a CSS file and we can still have a JavaScript file. The only thing is that by default, with our Replit here that we're going to be using, they don't make them by default. So if we want to add them, we have to add them in manually, right? Which is going to, create a bit of a pain for us, but it'll be okay. And instead of an index.html file, we're going to be given an index.php file. And it's this index.php file, which is going to be what's going to be interpreted by our server. And so when it's actually sent back from our server is actually going to send our browser an HTML file. Because remember, our browsers don't understand PHP. Our browsers understand HTML. So that's important to remember going forward. So let's create ourselves a new Replit here. I'm on Replit.com. I'm on the page right after you log in. I'm going to click create, and this time I'm going to type in PHP. And you get a few options here. You get PHP CLI. You do not want that one, right? That just gives you a command line interface. That's what CLI stands for. What you want is PHP Web Server. That's the one that you want. So you'll select that one, and you will select Create REPL. Now, in this instance, we can get rid of everything between the body tags. So we can just leave it empty here. And we can see here that if we look at this, right, this is our HTML skeleton. What we see here is just HTML. So that tells us something, right? The final product that our server sends us after it has interpreted our PHP into HTML is an HTML file, right? So it starts out with this file as an index.php file, but I can just write HTML in here if I want to. And that's going to be just fine. It's not going to meet our standards, right? It's because that's not technically PHP. But that's going to be just fine, because essentially all that I'm doing here is I'm skipping a step. Because at the end of the day, all my server's doing is interpreting what's going on in my code file here from PHP into HTML, right? Because we see if we go out here to my website page, what I end up with is basically an index.html. So that's an important thing for us to remember, especially, when we're starting to think about our final projects and what we need to be doing with our final projects. Because I do say you need to use PHP to some degree for your final project, but I don't say how much PHP you need to use for your final project. Right? Keep that in mind. So what we see here when we see this REPL after we run it, we see some new things here that we haven't seen before when we run a REPL previously with our websites, right? One is that we have this console window down here. And this is information from our virtual server. And the other is that this right here, instead of going back to saying run again, it still says stop. And that's because whenever we click run there, it starts our virtual PHP server. And it's actually running our website on a virtual PHP server until we click stop. And so once we click stop, our virtual PHP server shuts down and it goes back to, it goes offline, right? So whenever we want to do some testing, after we've changed and added some code, it doesn't automatically update, right? We have to actually stop our server and then start our server again before we can see those updates. And also, something for you all to remember, and this is incredibly, incredibly important. I will give you zeros if you don't do this. So you need to pay attention. Send me this URL, the URL to your Replit, when you submit this lab assignment. Because this is the only one that I can use to where I can tell that you wrote PHP. If you send me this one, which a lot of you ignore my instructions and send me, remember that my server interprets my PHP, changes it into HTML, and sends that to the browser. So on this side, this will just be HTML. This will not have any PHP visible in it if I look at the code. For your HTML, CSS, JavaScript labs, I let them slide because I could just view the page source and look at it that way. For this lab assignment, if you do this, I won't be able to see your PHP because that PHP that you wrote will be interpreted by the server. So I need this URL. And if you don't send me that URL, I will give you a 0 and tell you to resubmit it. Because I want to be able to see the PHP that you write in here. So let's get rid of this since it's not PHP, since this is just HTML. We're going to leave our HTML skeleton in here because we need that HTML skeleton as a foundation to work. And let's start out here by just writing a simple hello world. A simple hello world. So we're going to write a hello world. We've looked at hello world in other languages. We're going to write a hello world now in PHP. And a hello world looks like this, right? So in this case, I'm showing you in this syntax here that I can use HTML and PHP together. Right, the parts that we have here, this less than question mark PHP, that tells my server this is where the PHP begins, this is where you start to do work. So whenever my server is looking through this file, because it's going to look through the whole file, because it's a .php file, so it's going to look through the whole file and see if it needs to do work before it converts it to an HTML file and sends it to the browser. It's going to look through here and it's going to see, okay, less than question mark PHP. That's where I need to start to do work. Then anything that happens in between there, it knows is PHP. And so it is going to interpret that code accordingly. And in this case, we see a print statement here. And this print statement looks a lot like the print statements that we were using when we were doing Python, right? Print, and then in parentheses we have inside of quotes some string statement. In this case we have, our HTML tags in there too, because it's going to render out those HTML tags along with whatever text that I have in there. Now in PHP I have two different options to be able to write a hello world here. We'll do both of them. But before we switch back over and do that, whenever we're done writing PHP, we put this greater than question mark, or we put this question mark greater than, flip it and reverse it, right? We put this question mark greater than. That way my server knows its work is finished. So let's switch back to the replit here. We'll go ahead and stop our server. We'll run it again just so we see nothing here. And I'll zoom in so you can kind of see some stuff here. So we're going to less than question mark PHP. So with that, notice that I'm inside the body of my site. With that, my server knows, okay, less than question mark PHP. This is where I start to do work. Now we're going to write print F. We'll make this a H1 instead and a hello world. And we'll close our H1. Now in PHP, and we'll go ahead and put our question mark greater than at the end here. Now in PHP, one thing that's incredibly important is the semicolon at the end of a line. We've talked about in JavaScript how the semicolon at the end of the line acts like the period at the end of a sentence in English. But in JavaScript, you could get away with not putting a semicolon at the end of your line if you did it, on the right line. PHP is not that friendly with us. PHP doesn't let us get away with that. So if I leave my semicolon off here and try to run this, well, I think since I only have one line here, it's going to let me do it, which is anticlimactic. Let me add my echo statement in here and then try to run that again. Echo. Echo is another option that we can use instead of printf. So now if I try to run it, it's going to error out. Right, I think since I just had one line of code, that's the only case in which it's going to let me get away with not having a semicolon at the end of my line. But since I have two lines of code now, it's going to say, hey, where's that semicolon at the end of those lines of code? Need to see those there. Right, when I put those there, everything works. Right, so everything that's PHP goes between these two PHP tags. I can put a little bit of space between there. Right, we can kind of work that. Between, in these print statements or these echo statements, I can put any HTML that I want to put in there. Right, like if I wanted to make this a link, ahref equals http://www.google.com Google/a. Now notice what I did here, right? I put two single quotes inside of here wrapping the link and two double quotes on the outside wrapping the string. That way these quotes did not interfere with these quotes, because otherwise if I put a double quote here, it would think it was a pair with this first double quote, and it would get things confused, right? Because it's just going up to the next time it sees a double quote. So what I always do is I put double quotes on the outside, single quotes on the inside when I'm doing something like that. So I can put any sort of HTML inside of an echo statement or a printf statement like that. And if I click that, we actually probably need to pop it out into a new tab. If I click that, it's going to take me to Google. Right? Because it's Google. Now, for the sake of time here, I'm not going to dive deep into the other pieces that we'd want to do here. If we look at our PHP module here, I have this video here that talks about functions, loops, and conditionals. This one here specifically looks at the PHP info function that I have a slide on that I won't talk about today. I got a video here that looks at variables, some information here on conditionals, ternary operators, loops. Ternary operator is kind of interesting because it's a conditional that's within a singular statement. Maybe we could try to do something with that since we have it in there. Loops, functions, right? I actually think that's the wrong video that's supposed to be right there, because that's the video that's supposed to be here, which is interesting. I think when I was updating the videos, I put the wrong one in the wrong spot. But it's okay. We have these videos and this text to kind of get you to where you want to go with this. So what I want to do is I just want to walk you all through the lab. Since I did the lab together with the seeded class, I'll do it together with you all as well. So it says to create 10 different H1 headings using a loop, create 10 different paragraphs using a loop. And the headings and paragraphs should alternate. So we're talking about heading, paragraph, heading, paragraph, heading, paragraph. So if the number of headings on the page is even, the heading should be blue. Think CSS classes, it says. And if the number of the heading as it shows up on the page is odd, then the heading should be red. So let's start out with that. Let's start out just making the headings work. So that's one of the things that I suggest oftentimes is, whenever you're presented something like this with, a big problem where it's multiple parts, I suggest to kind of break it down into smaller parts and do things that way. Right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create myself a new replet. It's going to be a PHP replet. So we're going to use a PHP web server here. And one of the things that I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to make sure that I include, I'm going to go ahead and just delete everything out of the body here, leaving the body tags. I'm going to want to make sure that I include a CSS file here. So if I click this little new file page here, that's going to give me the option to make a new file here. I can write in the name of the file, style.css, and hit enter on my keyboard to create a CSS file. If I make sure I put the link to that in the heading here, it's going to connect this PHP file to that CSS file so that I can write CSS in that CSS file, and it can give me an output on the output here. So that is link rel equals style sheet, href equals style.css, which is the name of the file. And so I can test this, right, if we try to change the background color of our site. Body, background, dash color, blue. So if I do this and I run it and my background color is blue, when my page comes up, which it is, then I know that I've connected my CSS file here to my PHP file correctly. Right? So knowing that, I can remove this set of CSS rules from that CSS file. And now I'm ready to go on. So what I want to do is I want to create 10 different H1 headings using a loop. So let's start off just by trying to create 10 H1 headings using a loop. So we talk about doing this using a for loop in our course here. And so we've talked about kind of the idea of a for loop before, right? We have a starting point, we have an ending point, and we have an incrementation. Right? So if we look at my for loop here, I have 3 parts, 1, 2, 3. The first one here is my starting point, where I'm starting from. This is what I call my initialization. So I'm creating this variable x at 0. And that's where I'm starting from. So I'm starting at 0 in this example here. And so in my secondary here, I have my condition. x is less than or equal to 10. So what I'm saying is basically as long as x is less than or equal to 10, do what is inside of this code block. And then we increment x, our variable x plus plus, which means we add 1 to x each time. So the first time x is 0, the second time x is 1, the third time x is 2, and so on and so forth. Another thing that we talk about is functions. So let's do this in a function, right? So we'll call this function create headings. And we'll put our parentheses there, we'll add our curly braces there to establish our function. And then we will start out by just doing the small problem of just making the headings. So we're going to use a for loop for this. For $, we can use I equals 0. I is less, or $I is less than 10. Remember that when we are dealing with PHP, our variables always have to have a $sign in front of them. And then $I plus plus. Then we'll add some curly braces to create a block for what goes on inside of this conditional. And then we can just print F or echo out. I'm going to use print F because it is what I prefer. Now I am missing something here, which I hope some of you caught. Because if I try to run this now, I'm going to get a big error. Or actually, I'm not going to get an error at all because it's not going to know that this is PHP. Right? Because I didn't write my block there to actually initialize and tell my browser this is PHP, right? I forgot my less than question mark PHP. And then my question mark greater than to end my PHP. Tell my browser, or to tell my server rather, this is where you start to do work. This is where you end work. So now that I have that, right, we see a lot of the same things that we were doing, right, in Python, right? I'm using concatenation here. We use concatenation in Python, and we use concatenation in JavaScript, right? So I'm using these plus sign operators here for concatenation operators. If I run this, we don't get anything on our output. And that's because we've created a function, but we haven't called our function. So when we create a function like this, that is only half of the equation. However, not getting anything on our output at this point is a good sign because it means that we didn't get an error, right? So in order to actually see this on the output, we'd actually need to call our function, which means we need to actually add in the reference to the function name, which is create headings with the parentheses. And oops. There is that. And actually, we wouldn't want to, this is PHP. I can get away with doing this in PHP. That's what happens when you do too many programming languages in a given semester, right? No concatenation in PHP. You just wrap it in you wrap your variable names in curly braces. So I have heading number 0, heading number 1 here, heading number 2, heading number 3, so on and so forth. right? But I want to do headings number 1 through 10. So if I want to do that, I just need to change my starting point. So if I start at 1, then it'll start at 1 instead of 0. And then I can either change this to be less than 11 or less than or equal to 10. And that's going to generate all 10 headings. Now, that only gets me half of my equation, right? Because that gets me all 10 headings. So my for loop here is going to get me all 10 headings. And I'm going to add a little bit of space here just so we can get a little bit of room and see what's going on. Now that's all well and good, right? But it says if it's even, it should be... Let's see, do I still have that over here? Do I have that over here? Where did I put that? If the number of the heading is even, it should be blue. So headings 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 should be blue. We learned earlier in the semester that we can use a modulo to determine whether something's even, so we can actually add a conditional statement in here for even. Conditional statement in PHP. Hit the wrong button there. Conditional statement in PHP looks really similar to a conditional statement in other programming languages. We can use the same I value that we're using in our loop and just check to see if I modulo 2 equals 0. Right? Just like we would in other programming languages. And work from there. So if $I modulo 2 equals 0, then that means that this is even. So we would want to give this a class of blue. Otherwise, we can just copy and paste this, add a little else condition here, give this a class of red. Now we haven't added these classes into our CSS yet. What if we, oops, what did we do? Unexpected, semicolon on line 15. Do I not need one there? Doesn't seem right. Seems like I might have. Yeah, seems like I might have overlooked something here. Oh, I don't. Yeah, in an else condition, I don't need this statement here. That's what my problem is. Right. So, yeah, that's what happens when you try to do things too fast, too. Sometimes you just got to slow down a beat, right, guys? So if I pop this out and I look at this in the page source view here, I can see class red, class blue, class red, class blue, class red, class blue, class red, class blue, so on and so forth. Right? So now if I add a dot red to my CSS file and add a color red to it, and add a dot blue, and add a color blue to it, then we have alternating headings there of red and blue. Right, and that takes care of the majority, a little over half, right? I'd say roughly half of the lab assignment. Because we also want to create 10 paragraphs using a loop. Right? We already have the loop we want to use for that. It's the same loop here. Right? We don't want to create another loop for that. We want to take advantage of that same loop. So what we could do is we could nest another if statement into here, right? Which is going to make that a little more complicated to read. Or we could make a call to another function inside of here. So let's do that instead. Let's write another function. We'll call it big or small. And for this one, we need a parameter, right? And we talked about parameters with JavaScript. In Python or in PHP, parameters work the same. I can put a little variable name here in these parentheses, and this variable name, I'm going to call it x, allows me to take a value from outside of the function and bring it into the function. Right? So when I call the variable, I'm going to call the variable here big or small, and I'm going to call it with whatever the current value is at this point of I. So if this part triggers true, it's going to do this and give me the heading, and then it's going to call this function, which will allow it to run this with whatever the current value is of I. So it'll take whatever the value is of I, and at this point change it into x, and then we can just write our conditional statement to check to see if it's a big or small number. So if the number of the paragraph as it is shows up is less than 5, it should read, I was created with a small number. So if, in this case it is x, so if $x is less than 5, we are just going to print f a paragraph of I was created with a small number. Else, we are going to print f a paragraph of I was created with a large number. Right, so okay, so what's happening here? We also need to call this function in this else statement as well, because we want it to happen for both if the heading is blue or if the heading is red. Right, so we need it to happen in both cases here. So we're going to call the function in both instances. So we can just kind of go through kind of what's happening here. We call this function. Whenever we call our create headings function, it starts to run this create headings function. And it initializes this for loop. So we're starting at the value of 1, and we're saying while our I variable, which is starting at 1, is less than 10, we're going to run this code. And we're going to say, okay, 1 modulo 2. Is that equal to 0? It is not. So it's going to run this else condition. So it's going to print heading number 1, and then it's going to run big or small with the value 1 here in this place. And so it'll pass 1 into here, and it'll run, and it'll create a paragraph that says I was created with a small number because 1 is less than 5. At that point, it comes back here. It goes down, comes back to the top of the for loop, adds 1 to I becomes 2. 2 is still less than or equal to 10, so it's going to run all this code. 2 modulo 2 does equal 0, so it's going to run this code. Makes it blue, which we see here. Right, then it passes big or small with the number 2 down here. Big or small 2. 2 is less than 5. I was created with a small number. Comes back up. Adds 1. So on and so forth. Right, until we get the output that we are looking for. And if we look at what we get here, we get alternating headings with paragraphs, heading, paragraph, 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 heading, paragraph. Alternating headings based on whether they are even or odd, are red or blue. Odds are red. Evens are blue. Paragraphs, the first 4 paragraphs, paragraph 1, 2, 3, and 4, since those are all less than 5, say I was created with a small number. Paragraphs 5 to 10, say I was created with a large number, satisfying the conditions of the assignment. And there are different ways to approach this and different ways to do it. It's all about order of operations and how you choose to do things in a specific order. Another important thing that you might want to do here, right, is you can just kind of, you can write code around this. I can write HTML around this if I wanted to. And I can write CSS around it if I wanted to. Right? Like if I wanted to write my asterisk selector and add a font family, sans serif here. And I wanted to make a main tag. And I wanted to give it a width of 960 pixels. And I wanted to margin 0 auto. Right? I just added a little main wrapper around all of that. And I wanted to make a little body tag with a background color of green, just so we can kind of see this all work. Main needs to have a background color of white if I'm going to do that as well, right? Just so we can kind of see this work. Right, let's give a little bit of padding to that main there. Yes. Just so we can see our PHP and our HTML and our CSS all working together. And on the output again, right, if I view this code, page source, I don't see any PHP here, right? Which is why it's so important that you send me this link to this file. On this here, all I see is H1s and paragraphs. I don't see any PHP if I look at this one. I only see PHP if I look at this, because the PHP is interpreted by the server to get me to where we want to go. So, with that being said, we're roughly at the 1 hour mark now. So we're gonna wrap it up here. Right, I encourage you all to look at the rest of the stuff in the module, kind of get filled in on the gaps that we didn't cover here. Since we did walk through the assignment, and I actually walked through it with the seated class. The way we did it was just slightly different than the way we did it here, and it just goes to show you that, any of these coding projects that we do, we can do them many different ways. Well, that's where we'll stop for today. We will hang out for just a moment, just in case anybody who is here watching live has any questions. If you are watching the recording and you have questions, please let me know. As we are wrapping up next week, we will not have a regular live class next week. I will I'm involved in an event next Thursday afternoon that will be taking me away from campus, so I will not be here. I believe this particular module is probably simple enough to where you can handle it without the assistance of a live class, right? Just because I think everything's fairly well covered in the database module, but I will post another video to kind of supplement things. If there's one live class that we're going to miss in CTI 110 all semester, that's a good one to do it with, because that one's really well covered in the module in terms of everything that you need to do. So with that being said, that's where we'll wrap up for today. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.